I'm a high school history teacher, and for the past year I've been making videos where I explain the real historical events depicted in various video games. One of the games I've been requested to play many times is Call of Duty World War II. This game was controversial when it came out, so in this video I'll explain the historical context behind all the levels of the campaign, but stick around to the end for my thoughts on what this game does right and what it does wrong too. Grab a snack and a drink, and without further ado, let's get right into this. The campaign takes place on the Western Front of Europe in 1944-45, near the end of World War II. Before we get into the campaign, here's a brief summary of the causes of World War II and American involvement. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I in 1919, was very punitive towards Germany. Despite the fact that World War I was caused by a series of awful decisions by nations all over Europe, the blame for the war was placed entirely on Germany. As punishment, the German government had to pay reparations, demilitarize the Rhineland in the west, dismantle their air force, reduce the size of their military, and more. Given that the Germans surrendered while they were still in French territory in November 1918, a wave of patriotic nationalism spread across Germany in the 1920s, this feeling that they never lost the war, they were just betrayed. What made everything worse was that Germany experienced a terrible economic crisis of hyperinflation, and suddenly millions of people were broke. Adolf Hitler, who had been a soldier in the German army during World War I, took advantage of the widespread desperation, humiliation, and nationalism to build a popular following. When times are tough, the easiest and most psychologically effective thing to do is to blame someone else, so Hitler blamed Jews and communists for Germany's troubles. In 1933, after an election the previous year in which his Nazi party won a plurality of seats in the Reichstag, Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany. Immediately, he began undoing the Treaty of Versailles. He reintroduced conscription into the military, ordered the rebuilding of an air force, the Luftwaffe, and sent soldiers back into the Rhineland on the border with France. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, then later that year they annexed part of Czechoslovakia and invaded the rest of it later. Hitler's next target was the Danzig corridor in Poland, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. At this point, Britain and France had been appeasing Hitler, allowing him to violate the Treaty of Versailles and annex all this land without forcing him to back down. History looks negatively on Chamberlain and Daladier for this, but it's understandable when you think about it. World War I cost the British and French millions of lives only 20 years earlier. The memory of that horror was still fresh in people's minds. If appeasing Hitler would prevent another world war, maybe that wasn't such a horrible thing. Sadly, the results were exactly the opposite. Hitler perceived British and French appeasement as confirmation that nobody would stop him if he invaded Poland. If the British and French had enforced the Treaty of Versailles sooner, maybe World War II could have been avoided. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, promising to not invade each other in exchange for collaboration in the invasion of Poland and a new trade agreement. This pact shocked the world. Nobody expected Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union to join forces because they openly hated each other. In Hitler's book Mein Kampf, he even describes the need for German expansion into Eastern Europe. On September 1st, 1939, German forces smashed their way into Poland. The British and French responded by declaring war on Germany, but it was too late. Poland fell in just over 4 weeks, and with his eastern flank covered by the non-aggression pact with the Soviets, Hitler turned his eyes to Western Europe. In the spring of 1940, German armies conquered Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Finally, in June, the Germans accomplished what they couldn't in World War I. They defeated France. When France surrendered, Germany retained full control of the coastal regions for defense, while the interior was ruled by a puppet government located in Vichy. For the next 4 years, Western Europe would suffer under the iron fist of Nazi Germany. As all this was happening, the United States isolated itself from world affairs. In the 1930s, a series of neutrality acts were passed by Congress, confirming American isolationism as Europe became destabilized. The Great Depression had ravaged the American economy for years, and with the trauma of World War I still fresh in their minds, many Americans wanted nothing to do with the war in Europe. 20 years earlier, the arrival of American troops on the Western Front was one of the decisive factors that led to the surrender of Germany in World War I. Now, with the Americans staying out of the fight, Hitler believed that he could act with a free hand in Europe without fear of an American response. American isolationism combined with British and French appeasement and Soviet collaboration give Hitler the impression that he could succeed in building a great German empire in Europe. In the summer of 1940, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Hitler would win the war after all. France had been defeated, the Eastern Front was secured, and the only enemy he still faced was Britain. But by the end of 1941, a series of failures and bad decisions set the stage for Germany's defeat. So what happened? Well, first, the Luftwaffe failed to defeat the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. The failure of the Germans to establish air superiority over the English Channel meant that any land invasion of Britain would be nearly impossible. From the summer of 1940 to the summer of 1941, the British fought alone against Nazi Germany. But on June 22, 1941, Hitler made his second big mistake. On that day, over 3 million German soldiers poured into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in world history. After a series of devastating losses for the Soviet Union, they finally held the line outside of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42. Hitler then made the poor decision to keep extending the German assault in the south. In the winter of 1942-43, the Red Army won a hard-fought victory in Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle of the war. From then on, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat all the way back to Berlin by the spring of 1945. The third catastrophic mistake that Hitler made in 1941 was declaring war on the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the US initially kept its military out of Europe, but that didn't mean the US wasn't involved. Only a few weeks after the invasion of Poland, the US started supplying Britain and France with military equipment via a policy called cash and carry. In September 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, the US sold several destroyer-class warships to the British in exchange for military bases around the world, which are still owned by the US today. Shortly afterward, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act of 1940, the first act of peacetime conscription in American history. In March 1941, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, which pretty much ended American neutrality by providing weapons, ammunition, and other war material to Britain, France, China, and other nations free of charge. China is included here because they were at war with Japan in the Pacific. The Japanese had been slowly expanding their empire since the late 19th century. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of mainland China, and in 1940, the US started supplying the Chinese with weapons to fight the Japanese. In the fall of 1940, the Japanese, German, and Italian governments signed the Tripartite Pact, agreeing to come to each other's defense, although in Japan's case that never happened. In the summer of 1941, the US placed an embargo on oil shipments to Japan. At the time, the US was the world's largest oil producer, and Japan was heavily dependent on American oil, so this embargo hit their economy hard. By the end of 1941, the Japanese Empire had swallowed nearly the whole Western Pacific. On December 7th, the Japanese Navy and Air Force conducted a series of coordinated attacks against American, British, Dutch, and other territories in the Pacific, including the infamous bombing at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This led the United States to declare war on Japan, and only a few days later, Germany followed suit. This was a critical error on Hitler's part because the United States was primarily concerned with its own empire in the Pacific, not really Europe. Although Lend-Lease was already going on, Germany was not necessarily obligated to declare war on the US, except by the Tripartite Pact, which sounded good to the Axis powers on paper, but it was impossible to enact in reality given British and later American dominance of the oceans. Regardless, this meant that the US was now at war in the Pacific and in Europe. Call of Duty World War II follows a squad of the 1st Infantry Division in their campaign across Western Europe. The campaign begins with D-Day in June 1944, but before we can get to that bloody event, let's discuss the context of American military operations prior to the invasion of Normandy. Despite the Selective Service Act of 1940 and the size of the American population, the US military in early 1942 was not prepared for war. In the Pacific, the American fleet was badly damaged and needed time for repairs. Fortunately, the American economy was the largest in the world. By mid-late 1942, the American economy was producing military equipment at a rate greater than any other nation in history. The numbers are mind-boggling. Over 16 million Americans served in the military, over 100,000 tanks were built, and over 2 million other land vehicles, not to mention almost 300,000 aircraft and over 2,000 large warships. So many jobs were suddenly available for American men and women that most historians agree that World War II basically ended the Great Depression. In the Pacific, the US was making moves against Japan. At the Battle of Midway, the US decimated the Japanese fleet. They never recovered. A couple of months later, American Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal, launching the island hopping campaign that brought American soldiers closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. Sadly, none of this is shown in the campaign, so what about Europe? By 1942, the majority of fighting in Europe was taking place on the Eastern Front. By the end of the war, around 80% of all German soldiers killed had died fighting the Soviet Union, and the Red Army's losses numbered in the millions. Stalin pleaded with the British and Americans to open up a second front against Germany in the West, but American forces were primarily focused in the Pacific theater, and Britain lacked the manpower and resources to cross the English Channel themselves. So the decision was made to assault North Africa and later Italy to give the Americans time to amass a large enough force to strike into France. When the French surrendered in June 1940, their colonies in Africa fell into the hands of the Axis powers. Not all French Africans gave in, and there was fighting across West Africa throughout the early 1940s. In November 1942, American and British forces launched Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria to capture the Vichy French territories. By early 1943, the Allies had pushed eastward into Tunisia with the goal of capturing the city of Tunis. The Allies eventually captured Tunisia, but it was a difficult fight. In particular, the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 cost the Allies thousands of soldiers, but we'll come back to Kasserine later in the video. In July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily, capturing the island by mid-August. In September, the invasion of mainland Italy began. It was a bloody campaign, one of the deadliest in American history. Progress slowed down dramatically in the winter of 1943-44 as the mountainous terrain, muddy ground, fortified German defenses, and destroyed bridges made it difficult for the Allies to advance. It wasn't until 2 days before D-Day that the Allies finally captured Rome. While the invasion of Italy didn't reach all the way to Austria and Germany, it did lead to the removal of fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and it forced Germany to divert some troops there to reinforce their southern border. There was no way around it. The Allies would have to cross the English Channel and invade France head-on. The first mission of Call of Duty World War II takes place during the Allied landings in Normandy, France on June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in world history, was coordinated under the supervision of future American President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The plan involved sailing across the Channel, landing in France, securing supply lines, then sweeping to the east, straight into the heart of Germany. For nearly a year, the Allies engaged in strategic deception of the Germans, codenamed Operation Bodyguard. Since the Germans had control over all of Western Europe, their plan was to defend the entire west coast and rely on reinforcements to support the defense of any specific landing site. The most likely spot for an Allied landing from the German perspective was at the Pas de Calais, which was the shortest path across the English Channel, and it was where the Germans had positioned rocket launch sites to threaten British cities. As American forces built up in southern England over the course of late 1943 and early 44, they tricked the Germans to believe the attack would come at the Pas de Calais using confirmation bias. A fictional army complete with inflatable tanks and boats was set up in the southeast. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler was under the impression that the real attack was still going to come at the Pas de Calais, so he delayed sending reinforcements to Normandy for weeks. Starting the campaign, the opening cutscene tells us that World War II was the deadliest conflict in world history. 50 countries took part and 65 million people were killed. We hear radio broadcasts and see German infantry, tanks, and planes attack. Then we see our American protagonist, Ronald "Red" Daniels, signing up for the army, then fighting in Normandy and the forests of Western Europe. In the background, we hear bits of a real speech that President Franklin Roosevelt gave on the morning of D-Day. This intro is decent, but I have two issues with it. First, it doesn't give any context for how the US got involved in the war in Europe. You're just kind of thrown in. All of the context I provided in the first 12 minutes of this video is absent. Obviously, they can't explain everything in detail because it's a video game, not a documentary, but look at World at War did back in 2008. You can rewatch this cutscene again and again and learn something new each time. My second issue with this intro cutscene is more of a problem with the game in general. The focus is very narrow for such a huge conflict. If you're going to start off by saying how this was the biggest, worst war in history, why focus on only one part of it? The Western European front in World War II has been done to death by so many games and movies, why not try something different? By focusing on one squad of American soldiers on the Western Front, they missed out on bringing lesser known parts of World War II to life, like what Battlefield 5 did with its war stories. I guess my problem really is that the intro cutscene gives the impression that the game will be much bigger in scope than it really is. Moving on, the next cutscene is narrated by Daniels, who's writing in his journal to his brother Paul. Our squad mates are playing cards and hanging out below deck. There's Robert Zussman, the brash, likable loudmouth who is Daniels' best friend. There's Drew Stiles, the smart, glasses-wearing college grad who just wants to be a photographer, and there's Frank Aiello, the Catholic technician who is a veteran of the Battle of Kasserine Pass. On our way out of the room, we run into Sergeant William Pearson, the stereotypical hard-ass veteran who's battling his inner demons over what he saw at Kasserine. Our commanding officer is Lieutenant Joseph Turner, a West Point graduate and also a veteran of Kasserine. All he wants to do is get his men home safely. As the sun rises on June 6th, we hear a speech from Colonel Davis about glory, and the scene ends with Daniels writing in his journal. As our boat approaches the beaches, we're met with artillery and machine gun fire, and much of our squad is torn to shreds. The beach is soaked in blood, and men are dropping like flies. Lieutenant Turner grabs Daniels and helps him regain his focus. We have to get to the seawall. In real life, the amphibious assault force on D-Day landed on 5 different beaches in Normandy, the Americans at Omaha and Utah, Canadians at Juneau, and the British at Golden Sword. The game doesn't say it, but based on the geography and how bloody the assault is, it looks like we're at Omaha Beach. This was the bloodiest of the 5 beach landings, which resulted in over 2,400 Americans killed or wounded, one of the deadliest days in American history. Omaha featured the highest casualties in part because of the terrain. The high cliffs give the German defenders a significant advantage, able to mow down hundreds of American soldiers with their machine guns in the bunkers up high. Our job is to break through the seawall and capture those bunkers so we can secure a landing zone for reinforcements. We blow through some barbed wire, then make our way through the German trenches. I run across this American in hand-to-hand combat with a German, and if I'm quick, I have the opportunity to save him. These heroic moments are featured throughout the campaign in every level, and it's a nice touch, building a sense of brotherhood between the soldiers. Now I just have one quick question. Why is the Pepesha a Russian weapon here on this level? Normally it doesn't bother me if the weapons or uniforms are a little off, anachronism doesn't really bother me that much in video games, but the Red Army isn't even shown in this campaign, so why are there weapons here? Anyway, one thing I like about the gameplay is the fact that you have to use medkits to restore your health, no more just hiding behind cover until the jelly on your screen goes away. As we clear out the last bunkers, Zussman gets hurt and I drag him to safety while fending off waves of German soldiers with nothing but a pistol. I'm not a big fan of this action movie Hollywood portrayal of war, but that's a theme we'll come back to a few more times in this video. When Zussman is back to safety, we give him some morphine, then push onward to some local farmhouses where German artillery is shelling the beaches. We have to take out those guns to take pressure off the landing force. When the job's done, we meet up with our boys, and Daniels promises Zussman that they'll get through the war together. Sergeant Pearson gives Daniels a cynical welcome to the bloody first, and the level ends with a pep talk from Lieutenant Turner. This mission and several others in the campaign were inspired by the actions of the 1st Infantry Division of the US Army, nicknamed the Big Red One because of their insignia, which we can see on the shoulders and helmets of several soldiers. The Big Red One, or the Bloody First as Pearson calls it, is the oldest continuously serving division in the US Army. First formed in 1917 as the US was entering World War I, the division fought in the decisive Meuse-Argonne Offensive of 1918, saw action in World War II, was stationed in Berlin during the early Cold War, fought in Vietnam, in Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003, in Afghanistan, and in other recent operations. On D-Day, elements of the Big Red One did assault Omaha Beach and were tasked with moving inland to take the bluffs overlooking the beach, although the task of taking out the German artillery was actually assigned to other units. Still, it's a crucial part of the battle that I'm glad that they included. After securing their positions on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies pushed inland to take strategic cities. After over a month of attacks and counterattacks, British and Canadian forces finally captured the city of Caen on July 9th, securing their eastern flank for now. At the same time, American and British forces were targeting the city of Cherbourg on the coast of the Cotentin Peninsula because it would provide a deep-water port for larger-scale reinforcements. Cherbourg was finally captured on July 26th. With the beaches linked up, the eastern flank secured, and a deep-water port available for large-scale reinforcements, it was time for the next phase of the plan. The next mission of CoD World War II is named after Operation Cobra, the goal of which was to avoid a World War I-style stalemate on the Western Front and break through German defenses, pushing inland through France. Seizing the opportunity created by British and Canadian assaults near Caen on July 25th, the Big Red One launched an offensive southward to secure Western France. Capturing the region of Brittany would allow the Eastern forces to push towards Germany without fear of an attack from their rear. In the opening cutscene, the guys talk about some famous boxers of the 1930s, including Joe Louis, Max Schmeling, and Sugar Ray Robinson. Back in 1936, there was a famous boxing match between Joe Louis, an American celebrity and a successful black man in a time of racial segregation, versus Max Schmeling, hailing from Nazi Germany. The event was more than just a fight, it was a political spectacle, a showdown between democracy and fascism. Schmeling won the fight, but in a rematch 2 years later, Louis knocked him out in the first round. The talk about boxing is interrupted by Zussman, back from the hospital and ready to fight. We see some American planes fly overhead. I climb aboard a tank and head out for the assault. Sergeant Pearson chastises Zussman for coming back from the hospital so quickly. While we ride, Aiello gives us the backstory for why Pearson is so tough on the team.
Pearson, you know why he's always writing you? Kasserine Pass.
Lost my best friends there.
Yeah, earned him an Article 15 and a demotion. He had to be a hard ass, and his men paid the price. Mission was FUBAR, a massacre. Nazis had no mercy. Hell, we only survived because they didn't have time to seal the western exit. Almost lost everything thanks to that son of a bitch.
As I mentioned earlier, the real Battle of Kasserine Pass was a mess for the Americans. After the success of Operation Torch in landing Allied troops in Morocco and Algeria, the Allies tried to reach Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, before the Axis could reinforce the city. But the terrain was difficult and they weren't able to get there in time. Tunisia would have to be taken by force. The path to Tunis forced the Allies to advance through narrow mountain passes, an ideal situation for defenders. Initial efforts at breaking through were met with disaster as the Germans baited the Allies into ambushes and counterattacks, pushing them back. American forces, including the Big Red One, fell back and established defensive positions at Kasserine Pass. On February 19, 1943, General Rommel ordered an attack on the exhausted Americans. The Americans were brutally beaten back, forced to retreat over 50 miles. After about a week of fighting, the Allies eventually pushed the Germans back to the pass, where the Axis withdrew their forces. The city of Tunis was liberated a couple months later. The Americans lost over 3,000 soldiers killed at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and around the same number were taken prisoner by the Germans. We're riding on a tank, discussing whether or not to have sympathy for the dying Germans, when we're interrupted by Stuka dive bombers. Regrouping with Turner, we move to capture some local anti-air guns to shoot down the planes. Once they're taken care of, we move ahead to scout out the positions of German anti-tank guns, Pak-38s. On our way, we see some civilians hanged in a tree, and Stiles comments that it's a war crime. One of the horribly remarkable facts about World War II is that more civilians died in this war than soldiers. The Soviet Union and China lost the largest number of civilians to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan respectively. While the Allies bombed civilian targets during the war, the Axis powers were particularly cruel in their treatment of the peoples they occupied. Moving on, we find ourselves in the perfect flanking position to take out the Pak-38s and save our tanks. Eventually, we rendezvous with Colonel Davis, who gives us new orders to regroup with Charlie Company near Marigny. We hop in a jeep and drive through a crazy action movie set piece, gunning down German squads and vehicles until we finally reach Charlie Company and the mission ends. The next mission, Stronghold, picks up right where we left off. We're about to attack the town of Marigny. In the middle of the night, Daniels wakes up from a bad dream. When he was a kid, his older brother Paul was attacked by wolves and he hesitated, but luckily Paul was able to save himself. Now years later, Daniels remembers promising that he'll never let Paul down again. The next morning, we charge into Marigny with Pearson while Turner takes another squad to flank the enemy. I call in some air support to take down German vehicles. Ever since the German Luftwaffe failed to defeat the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain in 1940, it was clear that control of the skies would be a deciding factor in the outcome of the war. The horrific Eastern Front with the Soviet Union ground down German capabilities, and by late 1943, the Western Allies were bombing German infrastructure. By mid-1944 and the invasion of Western Europe, Allied air forces had achieved air superiority over northern France, meaning that they could bomb enemy targets without much resistance. As we see in the game, Allied aircraft played a vital role in supporting the troops in the front lines. By early 1945, air superiority turned into air supremacy, and this was when Allied bombing of Germany really took off. Hundreds of thousands of Germans lost their lives to Allied bombing, most notably in the bombing of Dresden, where an estimated 25,000 people died in just a couple of days in February 1945. Back to the game, I hop on an MG42 to clear the street for my squad, then we enter the church. Here we learn that Zussman is Jewish, a fact that will be relevant later in the story. After clearing the main room, I climb the bell tower to support the rest of our squad as they take out some anti-air gunners. A few minutes later, the flak guns spot me up in the tower and we get another high-octane, Hollywood-style action scene, complete with quick-time events as I barely escape alive. We hold off a German counterattack until our air forces can move in and drop some bombs way too close to us, and the mission ends. Now it's August 1944, and in the opening cutscene we learn that our mission is to sabotage a German train carrying supplies for V-2 rockets. We'll be joining forces with the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE for short. Back in 1940, the newly appointed Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the creation of a government agency dedicated to fighting and supplying guerrilla campaigns against Nazi-occupied Europe. They were inspired by the Irish Republican Army, which had fought guerrilla campaigns during the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. Throughout World War II, the SOE would instigate, supply, and coordinate covert and overt acts of resistance against the Germans and Italians. In the game, our squad is working with agents Arthur Crowley and Vivian Harris to execute the sabotage of the German train.
Reminds me of the time we parachuted into Vercors, ambushed that Gestapo patrol.
You're just an old romantic.
I think she's referring to the real-life Operation Cadillac, coordinated by the British SOE and the American OSS, the precursor to the CIA. On July 14, 1944, hundreds of Allied planes dropped thousands of supply crates across the Vercors region of France to help the resistance cause chaos behind German lines. When we're in position on this hill overlooking the valley, we spot our target.
Those V2s have a range of 200 miles, more than enough to hit Paris. We can't let it reach the launch site.
After Germany's failure in the Battle of Britain, the Nazi government turned to a strategy of terrorism. If they could target British civilian centers and scare the population, maybe the British people would pressure their government to make peace with the Germans. From September 1940 to May 1941, the Luftwaffe launched an intense bombing raid of London and other British cities known as the Blitz. As the strength of the Luftwaffe declined following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis looked for another way to terrorize the British public. The V-1 flying bomb, the world's first cruise missile, was first deployed a week after D-Day and had an operational range of around 250 kilometers or 160 miles. As the Allies captured more territory in France, the V-1s gradually lost their ability to reach the British Isles. So the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, was developed to further hit targets at a range of 320 kilometers or 200 miles. The V-1s were slow enough that Allied aircraft could intercept and shoot them down, but the V-2 flew too fast to be shot down. The V-2 was so powerful it became the first man-made object to reach outer space. After the war was over, many German V-2 rocket scientists were relocated to the United States to assist in building new rocket technology during the CIA's secret Operation Paperclip. In the final year of World War II, over 2,000 V-2 rockets were launched at Allied targets, causing thousands of deaths. This explains why a train-carrying V-2 rockets is such an important target for our team in this mission of the game. The goal of this mission is to be sneaky, but of course I'm terrible at stealth, so it isn't long before all hell breaks loose and we have to fight our way through like normal. Right as we get close, the train starts moving away, so we hop in a jeep and give chase. There are a lot of ridiculous, silly, gratuitous action scenes in this game, but this might just be the craziest one. Just look at this. The over-the-top Hollywood action scenes are fun entertainment, but I miss the grounded grittiness of the older COD games. Anyways, we're rescued from the rubble by Rousseau, a woman in the French resistance who we'll see plenty of in the next mission. In real life, Allied missions against the V-2 program, codenamed Operation Crossbow, didn't actually involve the SOE. Rather, the Allies launched a targeted bombing campaign to hit known V-2 launch sites. But the stealthy espionage makes for some fun gameplay, so I can see why they took this creative liberty. Speaking of stealth, on to the next mission, Liberation. In this level, we start off playing as Rousseau, where we infiltrate a Nazi garrison in Paris to take out a top German officer and help liberate the city. Our target is the Nazi chief of police, Heinrich, the fictional butcher who's been repressing the French resistance for years. He's directly responsible for the deaths of Rousseau's family members, so this is personal. As the mission begins, we're in the backseat of the car with SOE operative Crowley. I like how you have to remember the details of your cover story to avoid being spotted. It helps build the tension. I love all the little details like the conversations between the characters and the maps on the walls. It feels like I'm really sneaking into a Nazi headquarters. Overall, this is the most unique mission in the game, and it was one of my favorites. Down in the basement, I pick some locks to free imprisoned resistance fighters. Then I meet up with Oberst Fischer, our inside man. He's got the explosives in a briefcase, but he has to go to a meeting, so I head up to Heinrich's office. What follows is an extremely intense scene, reminiscent of the opening scene from the movie Inglourious Basterds. Fortunately, Heinrich is no Hans Landa, and he tries to fight me without a backup plan. Bad move on his part. In the midst of the confusion, I grab the explosives from Fischer and head out. I get stopped by this guard, and it's all about to go wrong, but I'm saved by Crowley. The whole place is on alert now, we're compromised, so I attach a suppressor to my pistol and head off to plant explosives, quietly killing guards and saving Fischer along the way. After a few failed attempts, I finally plant the explosives, and our perspective switches back to Daniels and his squad. When the gates detonate, we move in, fighting our way through the streets to Rousseau and Crowley's position. After a long, hard-fought battle, we hear that Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, who had been living in exile for years, is leading French forces into Paris. We celebrate the liberation of Paris, and fireworks pop off in the distance. In real life, the French resistance did play an important role in the invasion of France in 1944. The symbol we see on Rousseau's shoulder, the Cross of Lorraine, was adopted as the symbol of Free France and the resistance nearly immediately after the fall of France in June 1940. The French people who participated in the resistance came from many walks of life. There were aristocrats and students, Jews and Muslims, Catholics and communists, basically anyone who was alienated by the fascist Vichy French puppet state. These various groups often had different goals, which sometimes made collaboration difficult, but by 1944 there were hundreds of thousands of members in the French resistance, comprising around 2% of the total population. Throughout the occupation years, resistance movements published pamphlets telling people how to quietly resist, gathered intelligence for the Western Allies, sabotaged German infrastructure with homemade explosives, and even conducted assassinations and guerrilla warfare. The Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944 gave the resistance plenty of opportunities to fight back more actively. Some groups sabotaged German infrastructure to delay reinforcements, while others joined Allied soldiers directly on the front lines. The battle to liberate Paris began on August 19, 1944, when the military wing of the French resistance rose up in response to the approach of American forces. Allied forces entered Paris on the evening of August 24th, and the Germans surrendered the city the next day. Charles de Gaulle stepped in as the head of the provisional government. De Gaulle requested that a French unit be allowed to lead a victory parade the next day, a request which was granted under the condition that the leading unit be composed of only white soldiers, as many soldiers of the Free French Army were actually black colonial soldiers. See my video on Battlefield 5 for more about that story. Rousseau's character in COD World War II is likely based on Jeannie Rousseau, a real-life spy for the Allies in occupied France. She fed intelligence reports to London and contributed to the disruption of the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs. She was captured multiple times and spent time in concentration camps, and her work likely saved thousands of lives. Back to the game, the next mission, Collateral Damage, takes place a few weeks later during the Battle of Aachen. The 1st Infantry Division continued pushing east towards Germany. At the Battle of the Mons Pocket, they captured over 20,000 German soldiers while only losing less than 100. By mid-September, they had reached the Siegfried Line, a network of defensive fortifications on the German border. The Ruhr region of western Germany contained much of the Nazi war machine's industrial production. Capturing it was vital to the Allied war effort. The city of Aachen, located right on the Siegfried Line, was not a major production site for the German military, but it was symbolic to the German people as the historical capital of the supposed First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Charlemagne back in the 8th century. Seizing Aachen would deliver a blow to German morale and give the Allies a propaganda victory. The Battle of Aachen began on September 12, 1944, and although the city had not suffered from Allied bombing and it was mostly evacuated, civilians did get caught up in the fighting, and by the end of the battle over a month later, much of the city was destroyed by artillery. It was a slow, grinding battle with progress measured in houses and city blocks. By late October, the Americans had captured Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies. In the game, the opening cutscene shows the difficulty of the battle as we see dead American soldiers piled up next to a crumbling building. Daniels gets a letter from his girlfriend, and the guys joke about how it could be a Dear John letter. Turner is uncharacteristically harsh, yelling at the men to stop messing around. His brusque demeanor highlights how the difficulty of the Battle of Aachen weighs heavily on the men responsible for their fellow soldiers' lives. The next day, we're deep in the thick of it. Bullets rain down around us as we struggle to hold the plaza. I rush over to a field phone and use it to call in tank support. Our perspective shifts to Staff Sergeant Augustine Perez, the commander of an M4 Sherman tank. We push through the crumbling city, taking down German rocket launcher crews and panzer tanks as we make our way to Daniels and his team. When the tank arrives, we switch back to Daniels and continue through the streets to the fictional Hotel Allendorf, based on the real Hotel Quellenhof, which was the last major stronghold of German defenses at the Battle of Aachen. Down in the basement, we find a bunch of civilians hiding. Pearson wants to keep moving, but Turner wants to help save them, so we run outside to grab a truck and bring it back to evacuate the civilians. The young girl Anna almost gets left behind, but I run downstairs to save her. German reinforcements have overrun the hotel, so we quietly sneak past some patrols on our way up, and when we finally get outside, Anna's older sister Erica is tragically killed in the fighting. Civilians always suffer in war zones, and Germany in 1944-45 was no different. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died from Allied bombing alone, never mind the ground fighting. The Western Allies' ground forces did try to evacuate German civilians behind the front lines when they found them, but the Soviet Red Army was cruel and ruthless, seeking revenge for what the German army had done to their civilians in 1941-42. Altogether, the number of German civilian deaths by the end of World War II are estimated at between 1 and 3 million people. The next two missions, Death Factory and Hill 493, take place 3 weeks later during the Battle of Hürtgen Forest in November 1944. Ever since the success of the Normandy landings, the Western Allies' next major objective was to cross the Rhine River into the heart of Germany, but the stiff German resistance was slowing down their advance. Our current objective is to clear the Hürtgen Forest so our armored divisions can move through. Daniels finally opens the letter from his girlfriend. Turns out she's pregnant. Our moment of reflection is interrupted. Colonel Davis tells us that our objective is to capture a hill overlooking the Hürtgen Forest. We move out and secure defensive positions, holding off a German advance through the foggy forest. After the bridge is secured, we split off into 2 squads. I follow Turner downriver to provide cover for Pearson's squad. We take out some German mortar teams, and then we get trapped in the hell of an artillery barrage. The chaos of this scene with the trees exploding reminds me of those scenes from Band of Brothers, the World War II miniseries following a company of American paratroopers. I've discussed the horrors of modern artillery in other videos, so go watch those if you haven't seen them. I think this scene does a great job of capturing the fear of being in that situation. As we lie in the dirt, dazed and confused, Daniels hallucinates his older brother Paul again, encouraging him to keep going, to survive for his future family. Getting my bearings, I stumble through the eerily quiet forest, avoiding German patrols as I try to find our assembly point. On the way, I spot a German squad brutally murdering American soldiers who are trying to surrender. The cruelty of German soldiers in World War II is best demonstrated on the Eastern Front, where Nazi death squads routinely rounded up civilians to be executed. But American soldiers also faced the horrific barbarism of the Nazi army. The most infamous killing of American prisoners, the Malmedy Massacre, took place in December 1944. 84 American soldiers had surrendered, but were mercilessly executed by SS troops. Back to the game, I find Turner and we take out a sniper, then finally meet up with our guys at the rendezvous point, where we wait for Pearson's squad to show up. The next mission, Hill 493, continues right where we left off. We find out that Pearson took his squad ahead, now we have to rush to catch up to him. Our target is the artillery guns on top of the hill, and they give us a warm welcome as we approach. This mission is chaotic as hell. The music, artillery, machine gun fire, it all builds up to this intense action as we climb the hill. We finally regroup with Pearson, and I provide suppressing fire on the machine gun in the bunker as our engineer moves up with charges to blow it up. In a moment of calm, Turner and Pearson argue about the mission. Pearson wants to put the mission first, above all else, while Turner just wants to protect his men. We move through the trenches, slowly climbing the hill until we reach the top. I clear out the artillery guns, but we're ambushed by a Tiger tank and a ton of soldiers. With no explosives left, I use thermite to disable the Tiger. I'm knocked to the ground and Turner comes to help me up, but he's shot in the back. I drag him to safety, but his wounds are too severe. Turner offers to hold off the German counterattack to buy us time to leave. Pearson has to drag us away as we watch Turner's last stand. With our empathetic leader gone, Pearson's in charge, and things are about to get a lot darker. In real life, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest was the German victory. After nearly 3 months of fighting, the Germans stopped the Allied advance, clearing the forest to use as a staging ground for a new offensive, which we'll see in the next mission. Hill 493 in the game is likely based on Hill 400 in real life, a fiercely contested strategic point occupied by the Germans. Hill 400 was briefly captured by American forces before the Germans took it back and held it for months. Over 30,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. The notion that the war could be over by Christmas turned out to just be naive optimism. Our next mission, the Battle of the Bulge, portrays the real battle of the same name. With the Western Allies nearing the Rhine River and the Soviet Red Army slowly grinding its way to Berlin, Hitler was desperate to turn the tide of the war. Maybe if he launched a surprise attack in the West, he could demoralize the Allies enough to get them to agree to an armistice, then send his troops to the east. On December 16, 1944, German forces in the Ardennes launched a massive assault, taking the American forces by surprise. The foggy weather made the Allies' biggest tactical advantage, air supremacy, irrelevant. As a result, American forces were pushed back, creating a bulge in the front lines, hence the name the Battle of the Bulge. The town of Bastogne was completely surrounded and placed under siege, but the American forces there refused to surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, famously replied nuts to the German demands for surrender. Without proper winter clothing and limited supplies, the American forces bravely clung on to hope as the December cold creeped in. As all this was going on, the 1st Infantry Division was positioned at the northern end of the bulge, trying to repel German attacks. This is where our mission begins. It's Christmas Eve, and the guys are sharing some drinks around a fire in honor of Turner. By this point, the weather had started to clear, and General Patton's Third Army had broken through to Bastogne, rescuing the encircled Americans there. Now the Allies are preparing a counteroffensive to push the Germans back again. I'm not sure where exactly they're meant to be, but a fire would definitely not be allowed if they were at the front. It would give away their position. Pearson is taking Turner's death hard. He and Daniels almost come to blows, and the night ends bitterly. The next morning, we're greeted with frozen corpses in the snow as our tanks advance. It's our job to make sure they can break through the German lines. Our boys are shivering in the fog and snow in their foxhole. They comment on the fact that Stiles stole some boots off a dead soldier. This kind of pillaging from the dead was common in times of supply shortages, and the winter of 1944-45 was dire, especially for those cut off from supply lines in Bastogne. I bring a box of ammo to these guys in a foxhole, and I love the sense of humor here, having a homemade Christmas tree with shell casings as ornaments. It's always good to see soldiers making the best of a bad situation. After sniping some German stragglers across the front, I head back to the command tent where we meet Marcus Howard, a combat engineer and radio operator who's been assigned to our unit for this operation. Aiello comments,
I can't believe they let him fight.
Oh yeah, they even let us die.
During World War II, many places in the United States were still racially segregated. To avoid racial conflict and disunity in the armed forces, the military created separate all-black units such as the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions, 761st Tank Battalion, and the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Based on Aiello's comment, we can guess that Howard was a member of a support unit for the 9th Infantry Division during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. While all-black infantry combat units did exist, they were often kept off the front lines, serving instead as truck drivers, cooks, and other menial labor because they were seen as unfit for combat. Despite this, there are plenty of stories of black heroism during the war. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black military pilots trained in the US and one of the most successful bomber escort units in the entire war. The bravery of black soldiers during World War II is one of the reasons why the military was the first federal organization to be fully desegregated with the signing of the Executive Order 9981 by President Truman in 1948. Much like how women's participation in the war effort during World War I contributed to the movement for women's rights, the contributions of African Americans during World War II contributed to the civil rights movement. Back to the game, our supply convoy arrives and is immediately hit by artillery as we rush for a foxhole. We have to call in air support, so I charge ahead with Howard to find a radio in the small cabin. The radio is damaged, so I hold the line while Howard fixes it. Our perspective switches to the 509th Fighter Squadron, which had been providing air support for infantry and bomber escort since Normandy. I defend our bombers from German fighters, then get permission to peel off and go help out the boys on the ground. Switching back to Daniel's perspective, it's a desperate situation as we run low on ammo waiting for that air support. Finally, the planes arrive just in time, right as we're about to be overrun. Pearson, in a moment of panic, calls in an airstrike right on our position. We all survive, luckily, but the boys are questioning his leadership. The next mission, Ambush, takes place 2 days later. We're escorting a column of German prisoners when one runs off. We catch him and find orders to blow up a bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen.
If I'm reading this right, it's the last bridge standing across the Rhine.
That's correct. As the Western Allies approached Germany, the Nazis systematically destroyed any bridge that crossed the Rhine in an attempt to slow them down. In this mission, our job is to stop a German convoy from bringing explosives to the bridge at Remagen. We get in position and wait for the right moment to blow explosives, felling trees and trapping the convoy. Once they're all taken care of, we move to infiltrate an airbase where more explosives are located. It's not long before all hell breaks loose, and I dropped my silenced pistol and rifle in favor of something a bit more versatile. In the chaos of the fighting, Zussman is captured. I disobey Pearson and take a jeep to go after him, but it's no use. I crash, they get away, and I'm wounded. The next cutscene shows Zussman in a line of POWs. The German officer asks one of them to identify the Jews, and when the soldier refuses to out Zussman, he's shot in the head. Zussman and all the other prisoners board the train, their fate a mystery for now. 8 weeks later, Daniels is laying in a field hospital. Colonel Davis tells us we're heading back home to the States. We're a hero. Since the intel we found on that soldier turned out to be critical for the Allied war effort, we aren't being punished for disobeying Pearson's orders. The screen fades to black, and now it's 2 weeks later. Daniels is back home in Texas. The warm glow of the sunshine illuminates Hazel's smiling face as the pregnant woman rushes to give Daniels a hug. Another fade, and he's watching his newborn baby. Then another fade. He and Paul are out hunting, and Paul calls him a hero too. Turns out this whole sequence was all in Daniels' head. He thinks about the prospect of going home, but he can't stomach the thought of leaving without Zussman. The final mission, the Rhine, starts with Daniels choosing to rejoin his squad so they can end the war and save Zussman. After an intense argument about the truth at Kasserine Pass, Pearson finally acknowledges his past and decides to let Daniels join them. Our objective is to capture the Ludendorff Bridge, the last intact bridge across the Rhine River. By March 1945, the German High Command was in disarray. Hitler ordered General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of the Western Front, to fight where his forces stood, despite the general hoping to evacuate his men across the river. The Soviet Red Army was less than 100 miles away from Berlin, and German cities were being bombed with impunity. Taking the Ludendorff Bridge would mean a path for the Western Allies right into the heart of Germany. In the game, our convoy is assaulted as we approach the bridge. Using tanks as cover, we slowly advance up the hill. I follow this guy with a flamethrower into the bridge tower, and once that's cleared out, we start making our way across the bridge. Just like in real life, the Germans try to blow it up, but to everyone's surprise, the bridge remains standing. When Hitler heard of the American capture of the bridge, he ordered it to be destroyed at all costs. Just like in the game, but on the next day, Stuka dive bombers were sent to attack the bridge. In real life, they were stopped by American anti-aircraft fire, but in the game, Daniels uses German anti-aircraft guns to stop the dive bombers. Once the trenches and tunnels are clear, the remaining Germans surrender. Aiello apologizes to Howard for doubting him earlier, and Howard comments that we've just made history as the first to cross the Rhine. In real life, this battle was the first time an invading army had crossed the Rhine River since Napoleon in the early 19th century. Now we're getting reports of POW camps in the area, so Daniels and the boys head out to investigate. The epilogue takes place on April 4th, 1945, the day that American soldiers found the Buchenwald concentration camp complex. As we arrive, the place looks deserted. The guards set fires to try to erase any evidence of what happened there. When we enter one of the bunk rooms, Stiles recoils from the stench of rotting corpses. Daniels tells Stiles to take out his camera. The world's gotta know, he says. This is a reference to Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower's response to the discovery of German concentration camps. Eisenhower ordered American soldiers to visit the camps and take photos because he knew that someday people would deny that the Holocaust ever happened. I'm not the biggest fan of this section of the epilogue because I don't think it does an honest job portraying the horrors of the Holocaust. The bodies are hidden under blankets and in the shadows. Daniels' commentary describes the horrible things done by the Nazis, but we don't actually see much of the impact, which is weird because in the other parts of the game we did see lots of corpses laying around. The scene at the camp is really short, and we mostly just see some ruined buildings, barbed wire fences, and a couple of bodies. It doesn't stand out in comparison to the rest of the game. I'm not saying that every terrifying detail of the Holocaust had to be shown, but I was disappointed by its portrayal in this game because it felt disingenuous, like the developers wanted to include it just for emotional weight and shock value. In real life, the Holocaust wasn't just the concentration camps. It began with lies and propaganda. Hatred and violence doesn't begin overnight. It's a slow process that builds over time and plays on confirmation bias. Anti-Semitism had existed in Europe for over 1,000 years. The Jews were a convenient outsider group that you could blame for any and all problems. The Nazi atrocities against Jews, Poles, Soviets, and others were the culmination of years of increasingly violent actions by the German government. First, the Nuremberg laws stripped away the rights of Jews, turning them into second-class citizens. The widespread pogroms against Jews on the night of November 9th through 10th, 1938, better known as Kristallnacht, was not a unique phenomenon. This had happened many times before over the centuries. The majority of Europe's Jews lived in the Soviet Union, so when Hitler betrayed Stalin in 1941, that's when the killing really ramped up. Mobile death squads known as Einsatzgruppen sought to eliminate every Jew from every village and city that they came across. Then of course there were the concentration camps and death camps. The concentration camps were usually used for forced labor, but the death camps like Auschwitz held the gas chambers. Of the approximately 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, nearly half died in the gas chambers. CoD World War II puts a lot of effort into showing the details of several battles on the Western Front. I just wish that attention to detail was also given here. Back to the game, Pearson finds tracks leading into the woods, so we follow them, hoping to find Zussman. As we run, I have another flashback to that day in the woods with Paul. It turns out that the memories of Paul as an adult were all lies. Paul actually died that day because Daniels didn't act in time. The guilt weighs on him as we desperately look for Zussman in the woods. A lone German is about to shoot Zussman, but we get him first. Zussman is emaciated, clearly starved and abused during his stay in the camp, but he's alive. Daniels reflects on brotherhood, the only thing that gave him hope in the darkest times of the war. Flash forward 8 weeks later, and the war in Europe is over. Colonel Davis tells us that we'll always be known as heroes, and after some quick goodbyes, the boys all part ways. Pearson stays in the military where he feels most at home. Before he heads back to Texas, Daniels visits Zussman in the hospital and they promise to visit each other. Finally back home, Daniels visits Paul's grave, lays his bronze star on top of the tombstone, and hugs Hazel as the screen fades to black. In real life, World War II in Europe ended shortly after the Red Army captured Berlin. Hitler ended his own life on April 30th, 1945, and the rest of the German leadership surrendered on May 8th, now known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Germany would be divided between a capitalist West controlled by the Western Allies and a communist East controlled by the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War. In the Pacific, the fight against the Japanese continued for months. In August, Imperial Japan was finally brought to its knees by the combination of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the American nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, marked the official end of World War II. Somewhere between 50 and 70 million people were killed in this awful war, and it set the stage for geopolitical conflicts that still shake the world to this day. As the credits roll, let's talk about what I liked about this game and what I didn't. There were some good moments throughout the campaign. The depiction of D-Day at the start was intense, and almost all the missions followed real events from history. In the age of modern Call of Duty where historical events are barely mentioned, having a game set entirely in history was a breath of fresh air. It's clear that the developers did some research about the Western Front. I also really liked that stealth mission in Paris. The conflict between Turner and Pearson, while a bit overdramatic and cheesy at times, made me think about leadership and how it can change you as a person. Lastly, the theme of brotherhood weaved a coherent thread throughout the story. For a campaign that was less than 6 hours long, it packed a decent amount of character progression into the squad. You could feel the bond that they built. My first complaint with this campaign is that it was too narrowly focused. That scene at the end with Colonel Davis giving a speech makes it seem like the whole war was over, but the war in the Pacific was still raging on. In fact, the Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, was raging at the same time as we get this heroic homecoming speech. In real life, yes, some soldiers were able to return home immediately after the European campaign, but many immediately began training for redeployment to the Pacific. Focusing the entire game on just the American perspective in one theater of the war is a missed opportunity to show how all-encompassing this conflict was. World War II was the biggest, most destructive war in human history. Why not show other parts of the world? And if you're gonna focus on just the Americans versus Germans, why were there Russian and Japanese weapons in the campaign? Again, I don't normally complain about anachronism in video games, but this kinda rubbed me the wrong way. My second complaint is that several scenes felt too much like a Hollywood action movie. The destruction of that train, the collapsing church tower, the multiple scenes where I hold off charging waves of German soldiers with just a pistol, it felt like the game was making a spectacle of the war rather than showing what the soldiers actually went through. My third complaint is that the deeper issues touched on the game were pretty shallow. The racial tension between Aiello and Howard opened the door for some interesting commentary on the moral hypocrisy of racism in the US, but this theme is barely explored. We get a couple of lines of dialogue with no follow-up. It felt half-baked. For comparison, look at the Tirailleur war story from Battlefield 5. That campaign explored these themes much more deeply and effectively. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the portrayal of the Holocaust also felt half-finished. For comparison, let's look at the Soviet campaign from CoD World at War. We don't see the Holocaust per se, but the themes of vengeance and genocide are explored in more depth. Our character has to make moral decisions about how to deal with the retreating German army. Do we show mercy, or do we give in to the desire for revenge? Call of Duty World War II tells a feel-good story about brotherhood and sacrifice and plays it safe for the most part. It wasn't a terrible campaign, and it didn't come across as completely disrespectful, but I was a little disappointed, especially when you compare it to older games like World at War. What do you think about this campaign? Did you like it more or less than I did? Let me know in the comments. I really appreciate all the suggestions, support, and constructive feedback that you guys leave in the comments on my videos. Thank you so much. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the hype button below to help the algorithm promote my content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out for now.